All right, so we finished the 1940s, and I went on Wikipedia and I found like the list of shows that debuted in the 40s, and it was just a page for the 40s. But now in the 50s, each year has its own page because there's just too many shows. Like things have just exploded. So that's interesting just to see that the just the volume of stuff is way bigger. So basically, I started at 1950, and I'm just going to alphabetically go down and just, if it's a show I've never heard of in my life, we'll skip that and we'll just do whatever I've heard of. So the first show that I heard of is very different from these cowboy shows we've been watching because it's Buck Rogers.
Oh, space movie.
Yeah, so you got any Buck Rogers memories? I'm gonna guess you probably
Rogers.
you probably never saw this show, and I'll tell you why in a sec. But
The only thing I remember about Buck Rogers, and I think it was pre-TV, so again, he must have been maybe a radio guy.
yeah.
Because I remember we had a little kid's chair. Now, I would have been about 3 or 4 years old. A kid's chair. And the legs had come off the kid's chair. And we used to go flying around with those legs. We put a doll in it and go flying around the house, or it would be flying around the house with this doll in the legs of the chair that would be like a V shape.
Right.
And that's my first memory of Buck Rogers. And the doll I remember, had no hair on it, or the hair was all sucked off or whatever, had bad looking eyes. And
Been through some adventures.
yeah, yeah, and yeah. And I think it was the boys in our house who started that, but I remember also playing with that thing. So that's Buck Rogers, though, on television. I can't really say I remember seeing Buck Rogers on television. And so how would I have known about Buck Rogers in the early 50s? He wouldn't have had TV until later. So I bet he was radio.
Right. So
True.
yeah, that all checks out because I was looking this up and it's like, okay, Buck Rogers, 1950s show, and I found one episode of it, and I'm like, okay, good enough. And then as I started researching, the reason I found one episode is because there only is one episode that still survives. This show ran till 1951, and it's all missing. There's only one episode that still is around.
Okay.
So I'm like, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, well, see, I wasn't. Yeah, hey, I wasn't born. Well, I was born, but just born. I was an infant.
Yeah. So I mean, they obviously didn't rerun it a lot or anything because they probably just ran
How
it.
would I have known about Buck Rogers?
Well, let's see,
Unless
because
he's radio also.
well, let me just sec. I got the. Let me just open this up. I should have opened it up before. But yeah, I assume they must have only run that show for 1950 to 1951, and I think it was like wasn't necessarily on every station, and yeah, they just got lost.
Yeah.
But the basic Buck Rogers thing, it was created by a guy named Philip Nolan in a 1928 short story. And it's just amazing how I'm sure there was a zillion short stories no one cared about, but sometimes stuff just catches on, because by the next year, there was a Buck Rogers comic strip, and then 3 years later, the radio serial started.
So there is radio.
Yeah.
Yeah, and see, that's how I would know about it, because I've got older brothers, like a lot older, like 8-10 years older.
Right.
They would have been right into that stuff.
Well, the other thing that I thought was interesting is they went down a list of Buck Rogers was kind of the original space adventure guy, and then the other stuff all came after. And one of the ones that one of the imitators that came after was Flash Gordon. And that's where I suddenly realized Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon are two different things. Like, I've always heard them talked about, and in my mind I'm just like, oh yeah, the old retro space show. But I've never heard someone talk about them both at the same time. So I just always in my mind, Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon were the same thing. I never caught on that that's two different things until just now. So that's kind of interesting. But the other reason why you probably would know Buck Rogers, or everybody did, if you're in the mood to do a little extra credit this time, I thought this was interesting, is I found this one episode of that 50s TV show. But then there was a serial that ran for 12 episodes that they played in movie theaters in 1939, and those are all available. So I grabbed one of those, and I was thinking it might be neat to watch the crappy TV show and then go to the movie serial from 11 years earlier. I'm guessing is probably way better than this
Yeah.
forgotten TV show.
Yeah, well,
So they're both 20 minutes long, so if you want, we can check them
we'll
out.
check them both and do a comparison. Sure.
All right, cool. All right, so first we'll do the 1950s one, just because that's technically what we're doing here, and then we'll go back after.
In the 25th century, 1950.
Wow, this still looks pretty shit, but this is the only surviving one, so this is the best it's gonna get.
Buck Rogers in the 25th century. What's that up ahead? Looks like a great wall. That's the outer atmosphere of Saturn, buddy.
Yeah, how would he know that?
Classic cliffhanger.
Tragedy on Saturn. Chapter 2.
At this theater
This
next
theater
week.
next week.
Come back, kids.
So you'd have to save up your money for the week, your allowance and everything, just to go and check that out.
How much, I mean, do you have any idea how much it was back then to go to movie theaters and stuff?
Well, everything's relative. So even if
Yeah.
it was a quarter, it would be like
A lot of
$8 or
money.
$9 today.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely glad we watched both of those because, yeah, so the 1950s Buck Rogers, I mean, it's a shame that it's been lost to time and stuff, but based on that one random episode we saw, it was pretty bad.
Pretty poor.
Yeah.
And again, all I can say, 1950 was it?
Yeah.
There wouldn't have been a whole lot of people owning televisions. They would have just been like on the threshold of it. So if there wasn't a lot of money to produce things,
Then
you
I
did
guess,
it on the cheap. And boy,
Yeah.
they did it on the cheap.
Yeah, they were at, like, I think there was 2 sets for the whole show, and they were in one of them for at least 25 minutes, just the whole time. Yeah, it was
And they
definitely
just used like a living room set. That's all they
Yeah.
used for that.
just piano and stuff. Yeah, nothing special, nothing futuristic, that's for sure. Yeah, so that 1950s show, definitely, I never would have guessed in a million years what a Buck Rogers show was going to be. That it would be like a slow murder mystery of like. So yeah, it's like, all right, let's see. There's this professor who made some kind of, he had some formula that could be dangerous, and he just died. So Buck's female lieutenant person goes in to infiltrate the will reading because she needs to make sure she gets this thing out of the safe and that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. And they do a little seance about this doctor guy, and somebody dies, and it's just like, oh, it was all just a trick by the assistant to get the secret formula. And
Because she had devoted 30 years of her life to life with the professor and felt she was deserving and
Right.
that his daughters should not take everything.
And Buck and his people, they unravel the mystery. So that thing that just took me 30 seconds to describe, just imagine that over 28 minutes. It took for fucking ever, and it was really
It was pretty
slow.
pathetic.
And yeah, it just wasn't. And yeah, I was looking at those little YouTube comments, and so I was saying too how that only got uploaded 6 months ago. So that's kind of cool. If we had done this show last year, we would have no Buck Rogers to watch because they just rediscovered it. But yeah, the comments were mentioning how this traditionally Buck Rogers was like for kids, and this was like an evening grown-up show, and you can feel that. It's really slow, really boring. Had no reason to be a Buck Rogers show, so that was kind of lame. But then we jumped to the 1939 movie serial, and instantly it's a million times better. It's so cool of just like, that's when I imagine, I was saying how I confused Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon in my mind, but that is what I was thinking, like little models of ships that they had flying around and little ray guns, and that's just
So,
cool.
presume that you were, in 1939, you were a boy of 10 years old.
Yeah, I mean, I would have loved that. Like, especially, so they already had
10,
the
12,
little...
13, 14. And then, though, 10 years later, they're putting it on TV. And there's not that many TVs around. Well, what are the audience that you're going for? You're not going for kids because parents probably wouldn't let their kids stay up late to watch TV anyway. But you're aiming for those boys who were 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, who would now be 20, 21, 22, 23.
Oh, yeah, right.
And they would say, hey, Buck Rogers on TV, you got to watch that. Be my hero.
And now with my new matured tastes, this is exactly what I want. Just this fucking long, talky, boring
and
show.
of course, once you see it, though, you'd say, oh my God, that stinks.
It reminds me of...
That's why it wouldn't last on TV.
There was a Friday the 13th TV series for a while, Jason Voorhees with the hockey mask. But the TV series was just a horror anthology. It wasn't about Jason. So you watch it and there's no Jason. And you're like, well, what the hell was that? That's what this reminds me of. Like, you'd watch it because you see the Buck Rogers name and you'd be like, that's not Buck Rogers. That's just some other show, some Agatha Christie mystery that they put spacemen in with really gaudy outfits.
Yeah, terrible outfits. Like the outfits on the 1939 show were very classy.
Yeah.
Very streamlined. And they had a transformer in it. That really amazed me.
I didn't see
The body's
anything.
discombobulated.
A teleporter.
Yeah, a transporter.
Transporter,
Yeah,
that's
a
it.
transporter.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had one of those in it. When they looked into, like, when they were watching the bad guys, like on the viewing screen, it was very, very classy and streamlined. And whereas the one they had on the 1950 show, God, it was terrible. It was just like a great big box with a screen on it, and the guys were inside the box.
And like how on the little Wikipedia entry, they made a point of mentioning both of those series were relatively low budget, but there's the difference of like the 1939 one was low budget in a charming way, like all the little, you could tell it was little models that they were flying around, but it was so cool, like especially when they had the little model fly toward the mountain, and then the mountain like opens up, and it's clearly just again a little model that they just slide it open, and the little toy flies in, but it looks awesome. And then the 1950s one, it's like they made it for like $50. Like that's legitimately low budget. Like you could make it with your friends in your parlor with your made-up spacesuit that your mom sewed. Like, it's just really sucky.
Yeah, that's what it looked like.
But yeah, the 1939 one too, so it was cool. So that's where we got the actual origin. It's too bad we didn't get to see the 1950s version of the origin, but that one's missing. But yeah, so Buck was from 1938, and he crashes, but his science doctor friend has this special gas that puts you in suspended animations. He's like, oh, quick, before you go down, turn on the gas. So he wakes up 500 years later, and within 1 minute, he's like, oh, 500 years? Good golly.
Yeah, but then it's like, no problem.
Yeah, he's running a military operation. He's flying a ship to the edge of Saturn. He's like legitimately in outer space. He's just got it all figured out, no problem.
He can sit it down at the controls of that spaceship. No training, no questions asked. Just, honey, you go take a little snooze there, he says to the female operator. And he
Despite
just
this
sits right down
dogfight
and
that we're
takes
in.
off.
Yeah, just go take a nap. And it was funny, too, that the professor, when he wakes up, the future professor, starts right away giving him this guilt trip of like, we still have bad men in our time because you failed to stop these racketeers. And Buck's like, Jesus, buddy, is that really my fault? It was 500 years ago. But all right, if you want to put the blame on me, I'll go fix it then. And just takes over the military operation.
He's a real hero.
Yeah.
And as I said to you during the showing, he's a really handsome guy. Very, very nice looking fellow. Whereas the 1950s guy is kind of goofy. He's kind of like Mork from Mork.
Yeah, and looked like he was always reading his lines and stuff. Yeah, the 39 guy. What did you say his name was? You said you knew him?
Oh, that Buster Crabbe.
Yeah, so he was way better for
Yeah.
sure. It's funny too, his little friend Buddy in the 1939 one, who also got frozen with him. Like nowadays, it would be like they even did this in the Avengers a bit when Captain America gets frozen for 50 years, and when he wakes up, it's like you got a little existential crisis going on where all your friends are dead, all your family's dead, and you got to deal with this new world. It's kind of like you died, your whole life is gone. Not in this one. They don't give a shit about that. They're not going to deal with any crisis about being gone for 500 years. Buddy just goes, wow, I'd be old enough to be my own grandfather. And that's it. That's all they do.
And isn't he very much like
Robin and Bucky,
Batman
all
and
that
Robin,
shit.
all those young, you got the older guy, the experienced guy, the good-looking older fella, and you got the kid.
Yeah.
What's that? They always have kids with them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's because if you're a kid watching, you're like, wow, I couldn't possibly be Buck Rogers,
But
but
I could be that kid.
I could definitely be his little toadying follower. I could do that for sure. So that's like, again, I probably won't bother going to dig up more of that serial, but I could see watching that because like it is so neat to see.
Yeah,
how
I could see
they
you
manage.
saving your shekels for the week to get there to the
Yeah.
Saturday matinee next week because you had to see what happens at the edge of outer space, at the edge of Saturn.
And of course, yeah, it did end with that too, of just like, oh no, the whole ship's on fire and they're going down. What are they going to do? And I remember, because I always bring up how The Simpsons makes fun of all this stuff. The Simpsons had their superheroes, Radioactive Man, and they have his 1950s serial where it's like, look out, Fallout Boy, and a rocket hits the planet and the whole planet explodes. And they're like, tune in next week to see how he gets out of this one. Because it's always like the situation is so dire. And then next week they just reel it back a few minutes like that never happened. So it probably does that here too.
Well, that was a good comparison.
Yeah.
I would watch the 39 one again. I would watch that whole series of 12. No question asked. The 1951,
Yeah.
couldn't care less if
Yeah.
I ever saw that again.
Yeah, if they do find more episodes, like, that's fine. That's fine.
Pathetic.
Yeah, because it even, like, just to see how they did it, like even at the start when they're in the dirigible and it's going down, and just the snow in the background. And I'm just like, even just from a technical perspective, it's like, wow, how'd they do all these effects? Or even with the little models, it's like you can tell they're a model, but you can't see the strings. And there's a part where they show like a cityscape and a bunch of ships flying. And I'm like, man, I don't even know how they did that. That's really cool.
And that always fascinates me so much more than watching a lot of the stuff nowadays.
Oh,
Like
yeah,
it's
the
very
CG.
dramatic, but it's all computerized.
Yeah, I agree.
It's all generated. But this stuff, they actually physically had to create all those little things and make them work. Now that 1950s one, all they did is go to a warehouse and get a bunch of boxes and made their background in one of those scenes.
Yeah.
God, that was awful. And they didn't even line the boxes up well.
Yeah. Isn't it neat too to see how each different generation viewed the future? Like I always heard how before, like say Jules Verne, there was no science fiction. Like people couldn't conceive of the future. Like if you lived in a castle with a moat around it, you just thought you were going to make bigger castles and bigger moats forever. Like no one could really conceive of the modern era or of outer space or whatever. And then Jules Verne started with the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Journey to the Center of the Earth. It started getting there. So Buck Rogers, that's the 40s and 50s view of the future, which was just these like weird ray guns and swashbuckling, whatever. And then the 60s was like the Star Trek hippie version of the future. Like, let's all get along and let's all the peoples of the universe will come together. And then by the 80s, it was like the creepy Blade Runner future, where it's like the future's just going to be grimy and overpopulated and fucked up. and then by Star Trek The Next Generation, it was like a fucking office building flying through outer space. Like every generation has a different idea of what the future is going to be. And I think that's cool.
Well, they kind of build on the basic premise that they had,
Yeah.
which was this 30s, 40s stuff. And yeah, just elaborate on it and more and more and more. And
Or like, do you ever see Logan's Run from the 70s?
Yeah.
Man, like that is the most 70s future you could ever imagine. Like everyone is just braless and long hair and just like, I don't know. It's just, even the guy, I don't remember his name, but the guy who stars in Logan's Run was handsome for the 70s, but he's not handsome. They just thought that was what a handsome guy was for a little while. I don't know, it's weird. And yeah, then it gets into like the Terminator and like the future's going to be a nightmare. Like, I don't know. It's just interesting. So yeah, they definitely had a pretty rosy view of the future at this point, though. It was all going to be all right, you know?
yeah, except there's some bad guys now.
Yeah, I guess that they can't deal with whatsoever. Yeah, I think that's funny too, that he's like, the professor guy in one breath is like, we can't get rid of these evil men. We have no abilities. And then Buck's like, you guys have planes that can fly from planet to planet? Oh, of course we do. We can't deal with this one guy, but we can fly to Saturn. Like, that's not a problem.
Whereas in the 50s one that we saw, it was just like a little household
Yeah.
that they were dealing with.
Yeah.
The 1939 show was like a world. They were dealing with bad guys on this planet versus good guys on that planet.
I also love, too,
More worldly, I guess.
the other thing is how the bad guy said robot. If we have these helmets that turn them into robots, do you want me to put a robot helmet on you? And that's still like to this day, people, when they're making fun of old-timey robots, you know? So yeah, anyway, that was, definitely, thank God for the cereal. That saved this week, because it would have been a rough week without that. But yeah, it was, we fought through the real bad one, but then the good one was good. It was cool.
And you're still seeing early TV very rough. And I think that a lot of it had to do with the fact that there was limited advertising in those days because not that many people had television.
Yeah. Well, it's neat too with the film serial stuff. Maybe we should look into that more sometime because they seem like kind of good. Like one of the examples I always think of is so when I was a kid, they had the Merry Marvel Marching Society cartoons. They were terrible. They were like Spider-Man cartoons, really bad quality animation, like just dog shit. But I just thought that's what old cartoons were. But then if you go back to the Superman, let's let that thing go. Okay. But if you go back to, I think his name was Max Fleischer, he did these Superman cartoons in the 30s that are beautiful, super well animated, gorgeous. And it's like, wow, things were good in the 30s and then shit in the 70s. Because it was TV and it was
Okay, even
shit.
go back to your cartoons.
Right.
Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck.
Oh yeah, those were great.
Those guys started in the 30s and the 40s. Excellent. Not just the animation, but the whole storylines that went with them just were so well done, so tongue-in-cheek, so snappy and sharp, and the music that went with them was all this orchestral type music, and all the kids got introduced to that music through Bugs Bunny and all of those cartoons, which were so well done. There was a lot of money and time and effort put into those, and then cartoons became kind of like, yeah, well, those are just for kids. You can just pass off any piece of crap to those guys, and that's what they became.
Yeah, maybe we did ourselves a disservice by starting with TV. Maybe we should be watching, because those newsreels were also probably the most interesting thing we've watched so far. It's like, definitely the movie theater shit was way higher quality than this TV garbage for now.
Now, TV will probably, as we move into it and we see more dramas and, well, you'll move into like Bonanza and have Gun Will Travel and those kind of things. They're better, much better. And again, I believe it's because there's more advertising now, more money going into the system.
Yeah.
And more people buying TVs because now they're going to become affordable, which in the early part of this, what we're watching, they would have been very, very expensive, and very few people would have owned them.
Yeah, that's true too. Just that basic economics of it does make sense, because obviously in the movie theater serials, like, there's direct money. People pay to come see it, so you got money, so you can make something that's good. It's not. And I think that's a big reason too why American stuff is the best for decades. Like, I don't think anyone matched what America was doing until like recently, till like the 2000s, when you finally get like Korean movies that are as good as an American movie. Like, back in the day, it was always American shit is awesome, every other country's stuff fucking sucks, because America's got the money.
No, there were British movies that were...
Right. I mean, maybe movie-wise, but British TV is pretty bad. Like, when you look at old British TV, it's very low quality. Yeah.
The quality of it was very, very poor. Like Doctor Who is an example.
Yeah.
Into the 60s, when American TV had a pretty kind of savvy look to it. Something, the early Doctor Who shows.
Exterminate.
Oh, my
Exterminate.
God. They are pretty. They're almost, the caliber of them, the writing was good, but the sets and the makeup and the costuming was very much like this Buck Rogers one that we watched tonight.
Yeah.
Very, very cheap. But the storylines themselves were really good. They were like cheesy like that.
Yeah. Well,
freaking awful.
I'm going to guess too, again, I have no idea what's coming up next week. It'll still be 1950 for a little while, but because that Buck Rogers show, like, I think it's probably no coincidence that those serials are easy to find and everyone archived them, and the TV show's missing because no one cared because it's so shitty. So probably whatever we watch next is probably going to be better. So yeah, I guess join us next week for something that'll almost certainly be better than Buck Rogers. But yeah, if you're curious, those serials are all over the place. They're easy to find, the 30s ones, and they're pretty cool. They're good.
Definitely worthwhile watching those.